She rode into Redstone Ranch with 40 cents, a dead husband's name, and a cast iron skillet she refused to leave behind. By the time she rode out, she had burned an empire of lies to the ground. And the man who owned every acre of it had been hiding in plain sight the whole time, pretending to be nobody. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. If it hits you, hit that like button and stay with me until the very last word. This one's worth it. The stagecoach that carried Evelyn Mercer into Garrison Flats smelled like wet leather, old tobacco, and the particular kind of despair that soaks into wood after enough miles of hard road. She had been sitting in the back corner for 11 hours, wedged between a traveling salesman who talked too much and a crate of live chickens that didn't talk at all but made their opinions known in other ways. Her back ached. Her feet had gone numb somewhere around the third hour. And in the carpet bag pressed tight against her hip, she had exactly 43 cents, a folded letter of employment, and a photograph of a man she was still learning not to look at. She was 31 years old. She had buried a husband, sold a house she never really loved, and packed everything she owned into 2 bags. One for clothes, one for the tools of her trade. The cast iron skillet took up nearly a third of the second bag. The driver had given her a look when she'd handed it up to him at the depot in Cheyenne. She hadn't explained herself. You don't explain a cast iron skillet. Either you understand what it means to a woman who has fed people through grief and drought and the slow collapse of everything she thought her life would be, or you don't. Garrison Flats wasn't much to look at. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, and a post office that doubled as a barbershop on Saturdays. Dust on everything. The kind of dust that wasn't just dirt but seemed to be the town itself, slowly returning to the earth. 2 dogs slept in the middle of the road without any particular concern for the stagecoach rattling toward them. They moved at the last possible second, with the annoyed dignity of animals who had made their calculation and found it acceptable. The driver pulled up hard in front of the general store. Garrison Flats, he announced, as though anyone needed to be told they had arrived somewhere. Evelyn was the only one who got down here. She stood on the packed earth of the street and looked around while the driver unloaded her bags. The afternoon sun was already dropping toward the horizon, turning the sky the color of a bruise healing at the edges. Orange fading into pink, fading into the kind of purple that precedes dark. The air smelled like horse and sage, and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify. She unfolded the letter from her coat pocket and read the bottom line again, though she had memorized it weeks ago. Redstone Ranch, 7 miles northeast of Garrison Flats. Ask at the livery for directions. Report before dark if you can manage it. The man at the livery was named Orson, and he had the look of someone who had been interrupted at something important, though nothing in the livery suggested anything important was happening. He squinted at her letter like it might be in a foreign language, then squinted at her like she might be as well. Redstone, he said. That's right. Cook position? That's what the letter says. He scratched his jaw. Didn't know old Granger was looking for a woman cook. Mr. Granger isn't the one who hired me, Evelyn said. The employment agency in Cheyenne arranged it through the ranch's business agent. Orson looked at her like this was either very interesting or very troubling, and he hadn't yet decided which. Granger runs that place, he said. Has for going on 4 years. I'd watch my step if I were you. Thank you for the advice, she said. Can I hire a horse and cart? He had a mule and a flat wagon, which was close enough. He gave her directions that were longer than they needed to be, involving several landmarks that had ceased to exist, and she set off northeast with her 2 bags and her skillet as the last light was still clinging to the hills. She smelled Redstone Ranch before she saw it, wood smoke first, then cattle, then something underneath both of those, the particular smell of a lot of men living close together without enough water to wash as regularly as they ought to. She came over a low rise, and it spread out below her in the failing light. A main house dark and shuttered, a long bunkhouse lit from within, a cookhouse with smoke rising steady from its chimney, corrals, a barn big enough to swallow the livery stable in Garrison Flats twice over, and outbuildings scattered in the arrangement of things built over time by people with different ideas of where things should go. The land beyond was immense. Even in the low light, she could see it rolling out in every direction, grass gone brown with late summer, broken here and there by the dark thread of a creek and the occasional stand of cottonwood. Red rock formations rose to the northeast, giving the ranch its name. great slabs of sandstone the color of dried blood, catching the last of the sunset and throwing it back at the sky. It was not a pretty place in any conventional sense, but it was a serious place, and Evelyn had always respected seriousness more than beauty. She came down the rise and into the yard. A few men moving between the bunkhouse and the barn paused to look at her. Nobody offered to help with the wagon. Nobody spoke. She drove the mule up close to the cookhouse, climbed down, and was pulling her bags from the wagon bed when she heard boots on packed earth behind her. "You're the new cook." It wasn't a question. She turned to find a man standing 6 feet away, arms folded, watching her with the particular kind of attention that is more evaluation than greeting. He was perhaps 45, lean in the way of men who move constantly, with a face that would have been handsome once and had traveled somewhere else since then. His hat was pushed back and his eyes were a color she couldn't quite fix in the low light, some shade between gray and green that didn't seem to settle on either. "Evelyn Mercer," she said. She didn't extend her hand. She had already read the situation. "Rhett Granger, foreman." He let the word sit for a moment, weighting it. "The agency sent a woman." "The agency sent a cook," Evelyn said. "I happen to be a woman. If that's a problem, I'd appreciate knowing now before I unpack." Something moved across his face, too quick to read. Then he almost smiled, the way a man almost smiles when he's decided to be patient about something he doesn't intend to be patient about for long. "Get settled," he said. "Kitchen's through that door. Crew eats at 5:30 sharp. They'll expect coffee before that. Biscuits, whatever else you can manage tonight." He glanced at her bags. "I'll have someone bring those in." "I can manage my own bags." "Suit yourself." He turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse, and something about the unhurried way he moved, like a man who has all the time in the world because the world is going to wait for him, made the hair at the back of Evelyn's neck stand up very slightly. She carried her own bags inside. The cookhouse was bigger than she'd expected, and in worse shape than she'd hoped. The cast-iron stove was enormous, a good sign, but it was running dirty, the flue needing cleaning badly enough that the smoke had been blackening the ceiling for what looked like months. The work table was scarred and solid. Pots hung on a rack overhead, most of them serviceable. The larder was stocked adequately, though not generously, and organized in a way that suggested the previous cook had been working in a hurry or had stopped caring. Sacks of flour and cornmeal were stored on the floor instead of the shelves. Sugar next to coffee, next to a tin of axle grease, for some reason she didn't want to examine. Evelyn stood in the middle of it for a moment. She was tired from the road, and her back still ached, and she had a full crew to feed in less than 2 hours. She took off her coat, hung it on the peg behind the door, tied on her apron, and got to work. She didn't have time to do it right, but she did it as right as she could. Biscuits from scratch. She didn't trust whatever was in that covered tin near the flour sack. Salt pork because it was there, and it was fast. Beans that had been soaking since God knows when, but would do. Coffee ground fresh because a crew that worked the kind of hours these men worked deserved at least that. By 5:20, she had it ready. Not her best work, but honest work, the kind that didn't pretend to be more than it was. She laid it out on the long serving table that connected the cookhouse to the eating room through a pass-through window, and she stepped back and waited. They came in like weather, all at once, loud, carrying the smell of horses and hard work, filling the room to capacity in a matter of minutes. 40 men, give or take. 38, she would count later. Ages ranging from maybe 17 to somewhere past 60. Mostly white, 3 black men, 2 who looked to be Mexican, one whose background she genuinely couldn't place, but who ate with the same urgency as everyone else, so she supposed it didn't matter much. They ate. They didn't talk to her. They talked around her, over her, past her, the way people talk when they're not sure whether someone is worth addressing directly. A few of them glanced at the biscuits with something that might have been mild approval before shoveling them in. One man, a big one near the back with a beard that hadn't been tended to in a month, looked directly at the salt pork and then at her and made a face that was not complimentary. She ignored him and collected the empty platters. It was during cleanup, the crew filtering back out, the last of the evening light fading through the single cookhouse window, that she noticed him. He was at the end of the table, not the last man out, just the last man who hadn't yet moved, sitting over the remains of his meal with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. He was perhaps 40, though the outdoors aged a man, and she'd learned not to guess too precisely. Weathered was the word. His hands, resting flat on the table, were calloused and scarred in a way that spoke of decades of hard use. His clothes were clean but threadbare, patched at both elbows. His hat was beside him on the bench, and his hair was dark going gray in a way that happened unevenly, more gray at the temples, still mostly dark on top. He wasn't eating anymore. He was just sitting, and unlike the man with the beard who had looked at the salt pork with theatrical disgust, this man had cleaned his plate in a way that communicated something else. Not hunger exactly, but gratitude, though he clearly had no intention of expressing it to anyone. She had almost missed him. She nearly always would have, she thought. He had the quality of a man who worked very hard not to be noticed. She walked over. "Something wrong with your food?" she asked. Not hostile, just direct. He looked up. His eyes were dark brown, and they registered her with more attentiveness than she expected. The look of a man who pays attention to things other people overlook, which she recognized because she did the same thing herself. "No," he said. "It was good." "That's high praise around here, is it?" Something pulled at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Better than most nights." "That's a low bar." "Yes, ma'am. It is." She looked at his plate again. She'd noticed when she was laying out the food that by the time the end of the line reached the platters, there wasn't always much left. The men at the front had loaded their plates with the unconcerned authority of people who knew their place in the order of things. "Is there always enough?" she asked. The man looked at her for a moment, as if trying to determine whether the question was rhetorical or genuine. Apparently he decided genuine. "Depends on where you sit," he said. She nodded once and went back to the kitchen. She came back with what was left in the pot. Not much, but something, and set it in front of him without ceremony. He looked at it, then at her. "I've got to feed 38 men, she said, more to herself than to him, "which means I need to know who's eating and how much before I can feed anyone properly. That'll take me a week to figure out." She walked away again. She had dishes to wash and a stove to clean and a larder to organize, and tomorrow she would have to be up before 4 o'clock. When she glanced back from the kitchen doorway, the man was still sitting there. He was eating. Slowly, carefully, like he was paying attention to each bite. He looked up once and caught her looking, and he nodded. Just once, just slightly, and looked back at his plate. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know much of anything about him, but there was something in that small nod that she filed away without thinking about it. The way you file away a thing you don't know the meaning of yet, but sense you'll need later. His name, she would learn the following morning, was Caleb Ward. The first week was a study in being tested without anyone admitting they were testing her. The crew woke before she did the first morning. She'd misjudged and came into the cookhouse to find 3 men already waiting outside the door at 4:45, saying nothing, which was somehow worse than complaining. She never misjudged again after that. From day 2 onward, she was in the kitchen by 4:15, coffee on by 4:30, biscuits in the oven by 4:40. The biscuits were genuinely exceptional. She had been making biscuits since she was 9 years old, first in her mother's farmhouse kitchen, then in her own, and she had the particular skill of someone who has done something so many thousands of times that it has become instinct. She didn't measure. She knew by the feel of the dough. She knew when the oven was right not by temperature, there was no thermometer, but by sound and smell, by the way the heat came off the door when she cracked it. By the 3rd morning, even the man with the beard had stopped making faces. By the 5th morning, a younger hand named Denny, not yet 20, with an open, easily readable face that made him look like he was thinking every thought out loud, told her flat out that breakfast was better than it had been since a cook named Marvel had left 2 years prior. "That a compliment?" she asked, not looking up from the pan she was scrubbing. "Yes, ma'am," Denny said with the earnestness of the very young. "Marvell used to put honey in the cornbread. Do you know how to do that?" "I know how to do that." Denny appeared to think about this with deep seriousness. "I might be real happy here," he announced, and wandered back out. The other hands were less forthcoming. Most of them treated her the way working men of that era treated women in professional roles that weren't precisely domestic, which was with the particular combination of begrudging respect and reflexive dismissal that never quite decided which direction it was going. They ate her food and left their dishes without thanks, and didn't make eye contact unless they needed something. She didn't need them to thank her. She needed them to let her do her work. For the most part, that first week, they did. What she had not fully accounted for was Rhett Granger. He came into the kitchen the third morning while she was in the middle of the bread, her hands deep in dough. She heard the door but didn't turn. She was at a stage that didn't tolerate interruption. "Inventory list," he said. He put a piece of paper on the work table where she could see it. "I need it accounted for by the end of each month. Every sack, every tin, every pound of meat. You write down what you use and when." "I'm familiar with running a kitchen," she said. "Just making it clear," Granger said. "Previous cook let things slip. Things went missing." She turned the dough. "I don't let things slip." She could feel him in the room behind her. Still, in the same way he'd been still that first night. The stillness of a man who is comfortable being the most significant presence in a space. "That's good to hear," he said. His voice had a particular quality she was still calibrating, smooth on the surface, but with something underneath it that she couldn't quite name. Not anger. More like intention. "We'll get along fine, then." He left. She stood at the work table for a moment after the door closed, her hands still in the dough, thinking. Then she finished the bread. That afternoon, she found a composition book in the supply room, the kind meant for the ranch's general accounts. And she started her own inventory. Not the one Granger had requested. Her own. Every item in the larder counted and noted with dates. She knew what was there when she arrived. She would know what was there every day going forward. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because her husband's dairy had failed partly because nobody had been willing to pay attention to what was going where. And she had made a private promise to herself afterward that she would never again be unable to account for what was in her care. She kept the composition book under the bottom shelf of the larder, behind a sack of dried beans, where it was both accessible and invisible. It was at the end of that first week that she properly learned Caleb Ward's name, and something about the way she learned it struck her as meaningful in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She had started, from the second night onward, to hold back a portion of the evening meal, not a large portion, just enough, and set it at the end of the long table before the crew came in so that the men who arrived late or sat far back would have a guaranteed plate. It was a logistical solution, not a sentimental one. She needed to know that everyone was fed, and the simplest way to ensure that was to control distribution. The end-of-table portion, she noticed, reliably ended up in front of Caleb Ward. He always sat last. He never pushed for a better position. He came in quietly, took whatever space remained, and ate what was there. The first 3 nights, that portion system had meant the difference between him eating adequately and eating what amounted to the dregs of the meal. When she realized this, she made the portion slightly larger. On the 7th night, after the crew had cleared out, she was wiping down the serving table and he was still there. Same spot, same stillness. And she stopped in front of him. "You're Caleb Ward," she said. He looked up. "Yes, ma'am." "How long have you worked here?" He seemed to think about this. "Going on 3 years." "Where'd you come from before?" He looked at her with those attentive, quiet eyes, and she had the distinct impression he was deciding something. Not whether to answer, but how. "Various places," he said finally. "I move around." "Do you prefer this ranch to others you've worked?" The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard. He looked down at his plate and then back up. "The work is solid," he said. "Land's good." She folded her cloth. "You don't talk much." "Not much to say. Most men I've known who don't talk much are either very wise or very private," she said. "Can't always tell which until you've known them longer." He looked at her again with that quality of attention that she kept noting, the look of a man who actually heard what you said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "I suppose that's fair," he said. She picked up the cloth and moved on. She heard him rise a few minutes later, heard his boots on the floorboards, heard the door close. She didn't look up, but she had made a mental note. Caleb Ward, 3 years, from various places, and something that wasn't quite fitting, though she couldn't say yet what piece it was that didn't fit. By the second week, she had the operation of the cookhouse running in a way that satisfied her, which meant it was running well. Her days started before 4 and rarely ended before 8 in the evening, and there was always something in between that needed more attention than it was getting. The stove flue she still hadn't properly cleaned, the shelf brackets that were pulling loose from the larder wall, The fact that the water supply from the pump near the barn required carrying by bucket because the cookhouse pump was broken and apparently had been for months. She mentioned the pump to Granger on a Monday morning when he came by for the weekly accounting of supplies. "I'll see to it," he said, in a tone that communicated he would not see to it. "I'd appreciate it sooner than later. Hauling water by bucket costs me 20 minutes in the morning and another 10 at night. That's time that could go to the food." He gave her a look that she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man filing information away for later use. "I'll see to it," he said again, with exactly the same inflection. That afternoon, Caleb Ward appeared at the cookhouse door. She was in the middle of chopping onions, a task that she had made peace with over the years, though her eyes still protested, and looked up. "I heard you were having trouble with the pump," he said. She set down the knife. "Word travels fast. Bunkhouse is small." He glanced toward the pump. "I can take a look at it if you want. I fixed a few." She studied him for a moment. "Did Granger send you?" Something in his expression shifted. Subtle, barely there. "No," he said. "I just heard you mention it." She considered him, then she stepped back from the door. "Knock yourself out." He was at the pump for about 40 minutes. She could hear him working, the sound of tools against metal, the occasional sound of water running through pipes being tested. She went back to the onions and the stew she was building, and when he appeared in the doorway again, he said simply, "Should work now." She crossed to the pump and worked the handle. Water came up clean and immediate, with good pressure. She turned to look at him. He was already stepping back like a man who has done a thing and doesn't need to be thanked for it. "Thank you," she said anyway. He nodded in that same minimal way he had the first night and left. She stood at the now functional pump for a moment, water cooling her still onion-stinging hands, and thought about the fact that in 2 weeks on Redstone Ranch, the most practical help she had received had come from the man everyone else seemed to treat as barely worth noticing. So, the trouble started in the 3rd week. She noticed it first as an atmosphere, which is often how trouble announces itself. Conversations that stopped when she walked close to them. Men who had been starting to ease into ordinary exchanges with her suddenly reverting to silence. Glances exchanged over her head in the serving line, quick and sideways. By Thursday of that week, Denny, who lacked the social equipment to dissemble effectively, looked at her across the serving line with the expression of a person who has heard something troubling and is trying to decide whether to share it, which meant he was going to share it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Denny said, which meant the opposite. "Denny!" He looked at his boots. "There's some talk," he said. "What kind of talk?" He shifted his weight. "About supplies going missing, from the larder." She was very still for a moment. Then, "People are saying I'm stealing from the larder." Denny didn't answer, which was an answer. "Who's saying it?" she asked. He looked genuinely pained. "I don't want to cause trouble." She looked at him. Just looked, steadily, without hostility, which she found was often more effective than hostility. "Granger," Denny said quietly to his boots. She absorbed this. "And the others believe it?" "Some do. Some are... I don't know. It's easier to believe than not believe, I guess, when it comes from him." He looked up and his young face was genuinely troubled. "I don't believe it. I just wanted you to know it was going around." "Thank you," she said. "Here's your plate." He took it and left, glancing back once with the look of someone who has done a good deed and is now worried about what it will cost him. Evelyn served the rest of the line with the same efficient calm she always did. She did not let a single thing show on her face. When the crew was gone and the kitchen was quiet, she went to the larder, retrieved the composition book from behind the bean sack, and sat down at the work table. She had been keeping records every day, every item in and out, every meal's ingredient weighed and noted. She had the numbers for 3 weeks of feeding 38 men, and she knew every number on every page. She opened the book to the beginning and read through it slowly, not looking for what she'd recorded, but for what was between what she'd recorded, the gap, if there was one, between what she knew had been in the larder and what was there now. She cross-referenced twice. She checked every page. Then she sat back. There was a gap. But it wasn't in what she had used. It was in what had been there when she arrived. 3 sacks of flour, a case of tinned goods, a significant quantity of dried beef, the expensive kind, that the previous cook had presumably been using for the crew and which she had been rationing carefully. Gone. and not recently. The absence of dust in those spaces told her they had been gone for weeks, possibly before she arrived. Someone was stealing from Redstone Ranch. It was not her. The question was what to do about knowing. She closed the composition book and held it in both hands for a moment, thinking about Rhett Granger's face, about the way he had stood in her kitchen and told her about the previous cook, about things going missing, with exactly the same expression he'd used to build himself an excuse. She put the book back behind the bean sack. She did not sleep well that night. The following morning, Caleb Ward was the last one out of the cookhouse, as usual. She had gotten to the habit of having something extra set back for him. Not a large thing, just a proper portion that wasn't the dregs of what the front-of-line men had left behind. A woman who had run a kitchen long enough knew instinctively who wasn't getting enough, and Caleb Ward had the particular lean quality of a man who had been not getting enough for a while. As he rose to go, she said without looking up from the stove, "I've been hearing rumors." He paused. "About supplies going missing," she said. "About it being my fault." She heard him set down his coffee cup, slowly. "I know," he said. She turned to look at him. "You know?" "I've heard it." He was watching her with that attentive, steady look. "I don't think it's true. It's not true." She held his gaze. "I've kept records since the day I arrived. Every item, every meal. I can account for every grain of flour in this cookhouse." He was quiet for a moment. "Then the records matter." "Only if anyone's willing to look at them." She turned back to the stove. "Or willing to believe what they say." She heard him take a step toward the door, then stop. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. She looked back. "Keep the records somewhere safe," he said. "And keep watching. What you're tracking in the kitchen. Keep watching." She looked at him carefully. He was standing in the doorway with the morning light coming in behind him, and his face was unreadable in the way of a man who has decided exactly how much to say and is holding to that decision. "You know something," she said. "I know Redstone Ranch," he said. "I've been here a while." It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't nothing either. He left. She stood at the stove and turned what he'd said over in her mind, looking at it from different angles, trying to determine the shape of it. Keep watching. She kept watching. There was a Saturday, the 23rd day of her time at Redstone Ranch, that changed the geometry of things. Saturday afternoons were theoretically lighter for the crew. The serious work of the week was done, and there was a few hours before the evening meal when men sat outside the bunkhouse or wandered toward Garrison Flats if they had money for the saloon. The ranch ran on a skeleton crew Saturday nights, the foreman's orders, which meant Evelyn's Saturday suppers were simpler affairs than weeknight meals. She had an hour in the middle of the day that was genuinely free. She spent it walking. She hadn't had the chance to look at the property properly, and she was a woman who liked to understand the geography of wherever she found herself. She walked out past the corrals, past the barn, along the fence line heading northwest. The red rock formations were further out than they looked from the yard, and she didn't go all the way to them, but she got close enough to see the way the stone caught light, the way the shadow fell on the grass. She was on her way back when she found the second building. It was a low structure, almost invisible against the line of brush that grew along a dry creek bed about half a mile from the main cluster of ranch buildings. Not a house, more like a storage shed, but bigger and more solidly built than a shed needed to be. The door was padlocked. New padlock, she noted. Heavy. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she walked back to the cookhouse. She didn't say anything about the shed. Not yet. But she thought about it that evening while she was making the Saturday supper, turning it over the way she turned the composition book. Not obsessively, but carefully, the way you are careful with a thing that might be important. She thought about what Caleb Ward had said. Keep watching. She thought about the gap in her larder inventory. 3 sacks of flour, tinned goods, dried beef. She thought about the padlock, new, heavy. She thought about Rhett Granger, and the way his voice had been smooth and steady when he talked about the previous cook letting things slip. She made the Saturday supper and fed the reduced crew and cleaned the kitchen and put out the lamp and went to her small room off the back of the cookhouse and lay in the dark. The stars over Wyoming were not like stars anywhere else she had been. Too many of them, and too bright, and the sky was so clear that the whole vast pour of the Milky Way was visible through her single window, tilted toward the northeast. She stared up at it for a long time. She wasn't afraid. She had been afraid at other points in her life, when her husband was sick, at the end, when she had understood what was coming. In the weeks after, when the full weight of aloneness had settled on her in a way that no description of grief had ever prepared her for. She had lived on the other side of that fear. It had not destroyed her. The woman who arrived at Redstone Ranch was not the woman who had been afraid, but she was cautious, and she was paying attention. And somewhere on this ranch, behind a new padlock, in a shed that no one had mentioned to her, something was being hidden. She didn't know yet what it was, but she was beginning to understand that she was not just the new cook on a difficult ranch. She was standing in the middle of something, and she had better figure out what before it closed around her. Outside her window, a coyote called from somewhere in the dark hills, and another answered it from further off, and the sound traveled out across the empty land and disappeared. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was Sunday. She had biscuits to make before 4. Sunday passed, the way Sundays on working ranches tend to pass. Slower than weekdays, but not slow enough to rest properly in. Evelyn made biscuits and fried salt pork and kept the coffee coming, and the reduced crew moved through the cookhouse with slightly less urgency than usual, which was about as close to peaceful as Redstone Ranch seemed to get. She watched Granger across the yard from the cookhouse window while she was washing the breakfast dishes. He was talking to 2 of the senior hands, men she had identified by now as his regulars, the ones who laughed at what he said and positioned themselves physically close to him in the way that men do when they've made a calculation about power and decided which side they want to be standing on. One of them was the bearded man, whose name she had learned was Cutter. The other was a quiet, watchful hand named Pell, who had the eyes of a man who observed more than he participated. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She didn't need to. The body language told her enough, head slightly inclined, the particular way Granger held himself when he was giving instruction rather than making conversation. Whatever was being arranged, it wasn't casual. She went back to the dishes. That afternoon, she found Caleb Ward sitting on the fence of the near corral, not doing anything in particular, which was unusual enough to notice. She had not once seen him idle. He had a piece of wood in one hand and a small knife in the other, but he wasn't carving so much as thinking, the knife turning over in his fingers without purpose. She came up and leaned against the fence rail a few feet from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Below them in the corral, 3 horses moved in the slow, purposeless way of horses on a Sunday. "How long has Granger been running this ranch?" she asked. Caleb looked at the horses. "About 4 years. And before that?" "Before that there was a different foreman, man named Coates. He left." "Left how?" Caleb turned the knife over again. "Depends on who you ask. Granger says he quit. A couple of the older hands say it was less voluntary than that." She absorbed this. "And the owner? Who owns this place?" A pause, slightly longer than it needed to be. "A man named Holloway," Caleb said. "Nathan Holloway. He's not here, hasn't been for years. Word is he had some kind of personal trouble and left the operation to a business agent in Cheyenne who hired Granger to run it. That's a lot of trust to place in a foreman." "It is," Caleb said. He wasn't looking at her, but she had the sense he was paying attention to her response in the way he always paid attention, quietly, from an angle. "Does the business agent come around, check on things?" "Not in the time I've been here." She looked out at the red rock formations in the distance. A hawk was circling over them, riding a thermal, going nowhere in particular. "Someone's been stealing from the larder," she said. "Significant amounts. Before I got here, and probably since. Flour, tinned goods, dried beef. Enough that the crew's been eating short." She paused. "And there's a shed, out past the brush line northwest of the barn, padlocked, new lock." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I know about the shed," he said. She turned to look at him. His face was careful, not evasive. She was beginning to be able to tell the difference with him, which was itself interesting, but measured, the way of a man choosing his ground deliberately. "Caleb," she said. "Not yet," he said quietly. It wasn't dismissive. There was something almost apologetic in it, which was its own kind of signal. I need a little more time. I need to be sure of something before I tell you what I know." "You're asking me to wait. I'm asking you to trust me for a little longer," he said. He looked at her then, directly, and whatever she'd been uncertain about in his face resolved in that moment into something she could read clearly. He was not a man who asked for trust lightly, and he knew it was not something she gave lightly. And he was asking anyway. Keep your records. Keep them safe. Don't let Granger see them. He doesn't know about them. Good. She looked at him for a moment longer, reading his face the way she read the condition of a stove, looking for signs of what was happening inside, which you couldn't see directly but could infer from the evidence available on the surface. All right, she said. She pushed off from the fence and walked back toward the cookhouse. She didn't look back, but she heard him behind her, not following, just resuming his carving, the small sounds of the knife against wood starting up again with a kind of deliberateness that felt, for no reason she could name, like a decision being made. The trouble that had been building came to the surface on a Tuesday, 12 days after Denny's warning. It started in the serving line. She was ladling stew. A good stew, actually. She'd had the time to do it properly, with onions softened down and the meat browned before it went in the pot. The kind of stew that smelled right from outside the cookhouse door. When a hand named Briggs, a compact, sun-damaged man she'd had no particular cause to notice before, pushed his bowl back across the serving ledge at her. Short again, he said. She looked at the bowl. She had given him the same portion she'd given the last 6 men. It's the same portion as everyone else. Last week, it was more. He said it loudly enough for the men behind him in the line to hear. Week before that, too. Seems like every week there's less. Something going somewhere. The line had gone quiet the way lines go quiet when something is about to happen. Evelyn kept her face still. I can account for everything in this kitchen, she said. Every pound of beef, every cup of flour. Can you? Briggs said. He wasn't hostile exactly. More performing, the way a man performs when he knows he has an audience and someone has told him what to say. Because Granger says there's been goods going missing pretty regular. Then Granger should come talk to me about it directly, Evelyn said. Instead of sending it down the line, she held Briggs's gaze. You want more stew or not? Briggs took his bowl back. He wasn't satisfied, but he was hungry. And hunger tends to win arguments. He moved along. The line kept moving. But she felt the shift in it, the altered quality of the attention aimed at her, more pointed than before, less neutral. These were men who worked hard and trusted the order of things they could see, and Granger was someone they could see. And she was newer and therefore had to earn what he had by default. She kept ladling. That night, after cleanup, she sat down at the work table with the composition book and went through the numbers again, more carefully this time. She wasn't looking for a gap in her own records. She knew those were clean. She was looking for a pattern. The items missing from the initial inventory, the ones that had been gone before she arrived, were the high-value goods. Dried beef, the expensive grade, several tins of lard. The flour had been there in quantity when she arrived, but she'd noticed, around the end of the second week, that 2 sacks she could have sworn were at the back of the shelf were no longer there. She had written it down. She had written everything down. And looking at it now, laid out across the pages of the composition book, she could see a pattern that hadn't been visible when she was recording each day in isolation, the losses tracked with the calendar. Roughly every 10 days, something went missing. Not ransacked, not obviously stolen, just quietly not there, in amounts that you wouldn't notice if you weren't counting exactly. Someone with a key to the larder, or the ability to get one, was systematically removing goods on a schedule. She thought about the shed with the new padlock. She thought about the 10-day interval. She thought about the fact that roughly every 10 days, one of the Cheyenne freighters came through Garrison Flats on the main road north. She sat very still for a moment. Then she got up, put the composition book away, and went to bed. She had an early morning, and a clear head was more useful right now than a late-night speculation. But she lay awake for a while anyway, listening to the wind come off the high ground to the north, rattling the cookhouse windows in their frames. She had come to Redstone Ranch desperate for a fresh start. That was still true, but she had not come here to be made the convenient explanation for someone else's crime. And she was becoming increasingly clear on one thing: that was exactly what Rhett Granger intended her to be. The week that followed was the hardest since she'd arrived. The atmosphere in the cookhouse changed in the subtle, grinding way that atmospheres change when a rumor has taken root. Not an eruption, but a steady, low-level withdrawal. Men who had been starting to be comfortable around her stepped back into formality. Conversations that had been opening up closed again. The younger hands who'd been friendliest, Denny, a kid named Arlo who'd complimented her cornbread twice, stayed friendly in private and carefully neutral in the presence of their bunkmates. She didn't adjust herself to manage it. She kept doing the work the same way she had from the beginning, and she tried not to think about the grinding unfairness of it, which was difficult because the grinding unfairness of it was fairly constant. What she did adjust was her vigilance. She started paying attention to the rhythm of Granger's movements. When he was in the main house, which he had taken over as his personal quarters, though technically it was the ranch owner's residence, a fact she filed away alongside everything else. When he went to the outbuildings, when he met with Pell and Cutter, and what that meeting's duration and location suggested. She couldn't follow him without being obvious. She was the cook. Her domain was the cookhouse and the immediate area around it, and women who went wandering around ranch properties unescorted tended to attract the kind of attention she didn't need right now. But she could watch. And she did. It was Caleb Ward who, without being asked, became her second set of eyes. He didn't announce this. He didn't offer it as an arrangement. It simply became apparent over the course of that difficult week that he was also watching, and that occasionally, at the end of the evening meal when the cookhouse had emptied out, he would tell her something. Not much. A fragment. The way someone hands you a piece of a puzzle without indicating where it fits. Pell went to Garrison Flats yesterday, he said one evening, setting his coffee cup down. Came back with a wagon, parked it at the northwest end, past the brush line. She kept washing dishes. Was the wagon full going or coming? A pause. Going, it was empty. Coming, it wasn't. She considered this. That's the wrong direction for the Garrison Flats road. Yes, Caleb said. It is. She set a dish in the rack. You're not just watching out of general concern, she said. It wasn't hostile, just direct, which was generally how she operated. You have a specific reason. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch settled in. Horses shifting in the corral, the distant hoot of an owl, the low creak of the bunkhouse in the wind. I have a specific reason, he agreed, and you're still not ready to tell me what it is. I will be, he said, soon. She looked at him across the kitchen. He was sitting in his usual spot, at the end of the table, with his hands around the coffee cup, and he looked tired, she thought. Not physically tired, the other kind. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something for a long time without being able to put it down. All right, she said for the second time. Soon. She went back to the dishes. He finished his coffee, and after a while she heard him leave, quiet as always, the door clicking shut behind him. The thing about being isolated, genuinely isolated, not the social kind, but the kind where people have actively turned away from you, is that it reorganizes your sense of what you need to survive. Evelyn had been isolated before, in the months after her husband died, when well-meaning people had gradually reduced their visits and then stopped them altogether, because grief made them uncomfortable and life went on. She knew what it felt like to be alone in a room full of people. She was in it again here, and she didn't like it, but she could stand it. She had practice. What she couldn't stand was the threat to her name. She'd arrived at Redstone with almost nothing, 43 cents and a letter and a skillet. But she had arrived honest, and she had worked honest, and the idea that she might leave or be forced out with the reputation of a thief was something she felt not in her chest but in her spine, a cold certainty that she would not let that happen. Not again. She had spent the last 2 years rebuilding something of herself after her husband's death and the failure of the dairy, and she was not going to let Rhett Granger dismantle it because it was convenient for him. So she kept the composition book. She kept watching. She kept feeding 38 men 3 times a day with the same quality and the same care, because the work itself was its own kind of argument, and eventually arguments made from work tend to outlast arguments made from talk. The confrontation she had been anticipating came on a Friday. Granger came to the cookhouse at midday when the crew was out and she was alone prepping for the evening meal. He didn't knock. He never knocked. And he came in and stood in the middle of the kitchen with his arms folded and his face doing something she hadn't seen on it before, a barely contained agitation running just under the smooth surface like water under ice. I'm going to need to see your supply log, he said. She was chopping potatoes. She didn't stop. What supply log? The monthly accounting I asked you to keep. She had kept the accounting he'd asked for. She'd started it on day one, a separate document from the composition book, listing the official consumption figures he'd requested. It was clean and accurate and completely useless as evidence because it only recorded what she had used, not what had been there to begin with. "It's on the shelf," she said, gesturing with the knife toward the back of the kitchen, behind the small tin of salt. He crossed the kitchen and picked up the ledger she'd been keeping for his benefit and looked through it. She watched him out of the corner of her eye while she kept chopping. His expression as he read was calculated. He was looking for something specific, and he was either not finding it or not finding it in the form he wanted. "According to this," he said, "you've been going through flour at about 18 pounds a week. That's correct for the crew size. The previous cook was getting through 22. The previous cook was also less careful," she said. "I don't waste." Granger set the ledger down. He was looking at her with that flat assessment she recognized now, the one that preceded something. "Some of the men are saying the portions have been smaller. Some of the men have been saying a lot of things," she said. She set down the knife and turned to face him properly, because this was the kind of conversation you had face to face. "Mr. Granger, I have fed this crew 3 meals a day since I arrived, and I have not shorted a single man's portion. If portions seem smaller, it might be because they were unrealistically large before, which would account for the kind of waste that would explain the discrepancy you're looking for." His eyes went slightly colder. "Are you suggesting the previous cook was mismanaging?" "I'm suggesting there are several possible explanations for any gap in the supply numbers," she said carefully, "and my dishonesty is only one of them." The room was very quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove popped. "I'm going to need to take inventory," Granger said. "Myself, today." "You're welcome to," she said. "You'll find everything accounted for." He spent 20 minutes in the larder. She could hear him moving around in there, the sound of sacks being shifted, tins being moved. She went back to the potatoes and kept her face entirely neutral and her hands entirely steady. When he came out, he didn't say anything. He just looked at her with an expression that told her the inventory had confirmed what her own records confirmed, that nothing in the larder was missing on her watch. He had not found what he was looking for, which meant, she thought, that whatever was going to happen next would need to be something he arranged rather than something he found. He left without speaking. She stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of his boots crossing the yard, and she thought, he knows his evidence against me doesn't exist. So he is going to have to make it. She needed to tell Caleb. She waited until evening, after the meal, after the crew had cleared out, and it was just the two of them in the familiar end-of-day quiet. She told him what had happened, plainly and without drama. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's going to move soon," he said. "Whatever he's been planning, he'll push it forward now that he knows the ledger won't give him what he wants." "How soon?" He looked at her steadily. "I don't know, but—" He stopped. He looked down at his hands on the table, then back up, and she could see something resolving in his expression, some internal argument coming to its conclusion. "Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her first name. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about who I am." She pulled out the bench across from him and sat down. The lamp between them threw a small, steady circle of light, and beyond it, the kitchen was full of dark. "All right," she said, "tell me." He looked at her across the table, and she saw in his face the exhaustion she'd noticed before, and underneath it something older and more complicated that she hadn't had the name for until now, the look of a man who has been carrying a false version of himself for long enough that the weight of it has started to show. "My name isn't Caleb Ward," he said. She didn't say anything. She waited. "My name is Nathan Holloway," he said. "I own Redstone Ranch." The lamp flickered. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, a low, dry sound like paper turning. She looked at the man across the table, with the patched elbows, the calloused hands, the weathered face, and thought about 3 years of sitting at the end of the line, of taking the last seat, of being invisible by choice in a place that was entirely his. "Why?" she said. "Just that." His jaw tightened slightly. "Because I needed to see it clearly," he said. "What was really happening here? And I couldn't see it from the main house." He paused. "And because, after what happened, I wasn't ready to be Nathan Holloway again." She looked at him for a long moment. "What happened?" It came out slowly, in the careful way of a man who has not told a story in a long time and is not sure all the pieces are still in the right order. His wife. 3 years ago. An illness that had moved fast, faster than anyone had been prepared for, and a grief afterward that had done something to him that he still didn't fully have words for. He had closed the main house, handed operational authority to the business agent in Cheyenne, told a handful of trusted people he was leaving the territory, and instead walked back onto his own land with a different name and taken a bunk in a room with 11 other men. "I needed to be nobody for a while," he said. It doesn't sound crazy," she said. He looked at her. "It sounds like a man who was in a lot of pain doing the only thing he could think of," she said, "which isn't the same as crazy." He was quiet for a moment. "The business agent, Harkins, hired Granger based on references I didn't verify. I wasn't in a position to be paying close attention. By the time I started seeing what Granger was doing, I had been Caleb Ward for over a year, and I didn't have documentation on me to prove otherwise." He shook his head, a short, frustrated movement. "I've been building a case, slowly, watching what he moves and when and where it goes. I have records of my own, dates, amounts, the freight connection in Garrison Flats." "The freighter," she said, "going north." He looked at her sharply. "You figured that out." "The 10-day interval," she said, "and Pell's wagon going the wrong direction." Something moved in his face, not quite surprise, more like recognition. The look of a person realizing that the person across from them has been doing the same work they've been doing, from a different angle. "Together," he said, "the 2 sets of records might be enough." "Might be," she said. "They would be," he said, "if we can get them in front of the right person, the county sheriff, or the business agent, or—" He stopped. "Granger is going to try to remove you from the equation, Evelyn. He can see that you're a problem he didn't anticipate." She thought about the inventory that afternoon, the cold calculation in his eyes when he hadn't found what he was looking for. "I know," she said. "I won't let that happen." She looked at him carefully. He said it simply, without performance, the way a man states a fact. "I'm not asking you to protect me," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "That's not why I'm saying it." The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and dark, and absolutely indifferent to the 2 people sitting across from each other in a cookhouse kitchen, both of them in possession of secrets that were about to collide with someone who didn't intend to let either of them walk away clean. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Flour-dusted still, the knuckles roughened, the nails short and practical, the hands of a woman who had been working her whole life. "Then we need to be faster than he is," she said. "Yes," Nathan Holloway said, "we do." They didn't have as much time as they needed, and they both knew it. The morning after Nathan told her who he was, Evelyn woke before 4 as usual, lay in the dark for approximately 30 seconds, and then got up and started the coffee. She was not a woman who needed to process things slowly. She had processed it in the night while she slept, which was how she had always worked. Set a problem aside. Let it run underneath the surface. Wake up with a clearer shape of it. By the time the coffee was on, she knew what she thought. Nathan Holloway had made a complicated choice 3 years ago that she didn't entirely understand but could recognize as human. She had made complicated choices herself, in the wreckage of her own life, that probably looked questionable from the outside. The difference between them was that his choice had allowed Rhett Granger 4 years of unchecked authority over a property that didn't belong to him, and that had put her, and 40-odd working men, in a situation that was now genuinely dangerous. She wasn't angry at him exactly, but she wasn't inclined to be gentle about the reality of it either. He came in for breakfast with the crew, same as always, same end of the line, same quiet. She set his plate down without ceremony and said, low enough that only he could hear, "We need to compare records tonight. Bring yours." He nodded once and moved to his seat. The day proceeded with the particular surface normalcy of days that are anything but. She made breakfast and cleaned and prepped dinner and managed the afternoon with one part of her mind, while the other part was turning over logistics. What they had, in practical terms, her composition book, with 40-plus days of precise larder records, and Nathan's own documentation, which she hadn't yet seen but which he'd indicated covered dates, amounts, and the freight connection. What they needed, a way to get that documentation to someone with the authority to act on it, before Granger moved against her in whatever way he was planning. The problem was distance. The county sheriff was in Mill Haven, 40 miles southeast. The business agent, Harkins, was in Cheyenne, which was further. Any message sent through Garrison Flats risked Granger having contacts there. She had no way to know who in that small town was in his pocket. And Nathan couldn't simply ride to Mill Haven or Cheyenne himself, because the moment he did, if Granger noticed Caleb Ward's absence and connected it to anything, it would force a confrontation before they were ready. She was thinking about this while making cornbread that afternoon, when Denny appeared at the cookhouse door, hat in hand, which meant he was either apologizing for something or about to ask a favor. "Which is it?" she said, not looking up from the pan. "Ma'am?" "The hat. You're holding it like a man who wants something." Denny had the grace to look caught. "I was going to ride to Garrison Flats Saturday," he said. "Pick up some things at the general store. Granger gave a few of us permission." He paused. "I thought, if you needed anything sent or picked up or, I don't know, whatever you might need." She looked at him then. He was earnest in the particular way of young men who haven't yet learned to be strategic about their kindness, which meant his offer was genuine and therefore useful. "I might need a letter delivered," she said, "to the post office for Cheyenne." "I can do that." Quietly. Denny's expression became more serious, which she appreciated. He was not entirely without sense. "Yes, ma'am," quietly. "I'll have it ready Friday night," she said. "Don't mention it to anyone." He nodded and left with the air of a young man who has been trusted with something and intends to be worthy of it. That night, she and Nathan sat at the work table for 2 hours with both sets of records spread between them. He had his in a flat leather folder, the kind meant for property documents, which he'd kept hidden. She didn't ask where, for the better part of a year. She laid her composition book alongside it, and they went through both systematically, page by page. The picture that emerged was worse than either of them had individually understood. Granger had been systematically diverting ranch supplies, food, equipment, and most significantly, livestock, for at least 3 years. Nathan's records showed cattle numbers that didn't match the ranch's official tallies. Evelyn's larder records showed the supply theft was ongoing and accelerating. The 10-day freight connection she'd identified matched, with near-perfect regularity, with dates in Nathan's notes when he'd observed unexplained wagon movement on the property. The total, roughly calculated, was significant enough that Nathan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He's been running this place like his own private enterprise," he said. It came out flat, without inflection, which was sometimes worse than anger. "Yes." She looked at the numbers again. "There's something else." He looked at her. "The acceleration," she said. "It's been increasing every month for the last 4 months. That's not someone who intends to keep this going indefinitely." She traced the column of figures with her finger. "That's someone who's planning to stop." Nathan followed her reasoning. She could see it arrive on his face. "He's building towards something, an exit, or a consolidation," she said. "He's foreman. He has operational authority while Harkins is in Cheyenne. If he can document the ranch as financially failing," she stopped. "And provide a willing buyer," Nathan said quietly. They looked at each other across the table. "He intends to sell Redstone," Nathan said, "on behalf of Harkins, who thinks he has the authority to authorize a sale in extremis, pocket the proceeds, and be gone before anyone understands what happened." "And a theft accusation against the cook," Evelyn said, "becomes part of the paper trail that explains the financial decline." The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the wind was up, moving off the high country with a cold edge that the daylight hours hadn't had. The first real taste of what was coming, seasonally speaking. "How long do we have?" she asked. "I don't know." He put both hands flat on the table in a gesture she recognized as his version of steadying himself. "The next freighter north comes through Garrison Flats in 6 days. If that's his timeline, the letter to Harkins needs to go Saturday," she said. "Denny can take it. Harkins has to be told who I am," Nathan said. "He's dealt with Holloway through correspondence for 3 years, but we've never met in person. I'll need to include documentation." He paused. "It might not be enough, or it might not arrive in time. So we also need local support," she said. "Some of the crew." He was quiet for a moment. This was the harder calculation, and they both knew it. The crew's loyalty was to whoever signed the payroll and controlled daily life on the ranch, which was Granger. Some of the men, Cutter and Pell certainly, were too far into his operation to be trusted. Others, like the man with no great love for anyone in particular who just wanted to do his work and be left alone, were unknown quantities. "Denny," Evelyn said, "he's a kid. He's loyal, and he's not afraid of Granger the way the older men are." She thought for a moment. "There's also a man named Harlan, the older one, the one who shoes the horses." "I know Harlan," Nathan considered. "He's been here longer than Granger. He doesn't like him. He's never said it directly, but—" "You can tell," Evelyn said, "the way he gets quiet when Granger talks. Some men go quiet when they disagree instead of speaking up. Harlan is one of those." Nathan looked at her with a particular expression she was getting used to, the one he got when she had said something that matched his own assessment so precisely that it seemed to surprise him, though it probably shouldn't have anymore. "All right," he said. "Harlan." They worked out the letter to Harkins together at the work table, Nathan writing in a cramped but clear hand, Evelyn reading over his shoulder and occasionally suggesting a plainer construction when his language became too formal for the urgency of the situation. He enclosed 3 pages of his documentation: the cattle numbers, the freight dates, a summary of Granger's financial diversion, and a brief account of who he was and what he'd been doing for 3 years, which he wrote without elaboration or self-justification, which she thought was probably the right approach. When it was done, she sealed it and wrote Harkins's Cheyenne address on the front in her own hand, cleaner than Nathan's, and held it for a moment. "If Granger intercepts this," she said, "he won't have reason to check Denny's saddlebag." "He might not need a reason." Nathan looked at the letter in her hand. "No," he said. "He might not." She put it in her apron pocket. She would give it to Denny tomorrow, Friday, which gave her one more day with it on her person, which was the safest place for it right now. They gathered the records back into their respective places, the composition book behind the bean sack, Nathan's leather folder wherever he kept it, and the lamp was getting low. "You should get back before someone notices you're still here," she said. He stood, and she stood, and for a moment they were both standing in the small kitchen in the low lamplight with the wind pushing at the windows and everything they'd just laid out between them still hanging in the air. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the position you're in. You came here for a job, not—" He gestured vaguely at the evidence of the last 2 hours. "This. I came here for a fresh start," she said. "That hasn't changed." She picked up the lamp to carry it to the door. "It might just be a rougher road to it than I was expecting." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was different from how it had looked for the weeks she'd known him, or thought she'd known him, as Caleb Ward. Slightly less contained, like a man who has, for the first time in a long time, told the truth to someone and found the sky didn't fall. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. "Good night, Nathan," she said. It was the first time she'd used his real name, and it felt strange and right at the same time, the way new things often do. He left. She bolted the cookhouse door and went to her room and lay in the dark, listening to the wind. She didn't sleep for a long time. The following morning, Thursday, Granger made his move. She didn't know it was his move at first. It began as a routine morning, the crew through breakfast, the kitchen clean, the prep for the midday meal underway. It was Harlan who came to tell her, appearing at the cookhouse door with the particular expression of a man delivering news he'd rather not. "Granger's called a general assembly," Harlan said. He was perhaps 60, with a face like old leather and eyes that were still sharp. "Yard in 20 minutes. He said everyone's required." She looked at him. "Everyone including me?" Harlan looked uncomfortable. "He didn't specify you by name, but—" He paused in a way that was its own specification. "What's it about?" Harlan looked at his boots. He had the posture of a man who knows more than he's saying and is deciding whether to say it. "There's been talk all week," he said quietly, "about the supplies, about—" He stopped and looked up at her, and his old eyes were direct in a way she respected. "I don't believe it, Mrs. Mercer, for what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "Thank you, Harlan." She untied her apron, hung it on the peg, and walked out to the yard. The crew was already assembling, the full complement, 38 men, pulling together in the loose, reluctant way of people who have been summoned and aren't sure whether to be curious or worried. Granger stood at the center of it on the raised ground near the main corral fence, Pell and Cutter flanking him with the studied casualness of men who had been positioned. Evelyn walked to the edge of the assembly and stood there. Several men glanced at her and looked away. Denny, on the far side of the group, caught her eye and held it with an expression of anxious solidarity. Nathan, Caleb, was near the back, leaning against the fence post in his usual way. He was watching Granger, not her. Granger looked around the assembled crew with the slow satisfaction of a man who has arranged everything to his liking. "I'm not going to waste your time," he said. He had a good voice for this kind of thing. Carrying, assured, the voice of a man who had practiced authority so long it had become natural. "This ranch has been losing supplies for the past several months. Food stores primarily, but also equipment. I've been tracking it, and I've identified the source." The yard was very quiet. Granger's eyes moved to Evelyn. Just briefly, a flicker, and then back to the General Assembly, but the message was received by everyone present. She could feel the shift in the group's attention, the way it angled toward her. "The evidence points to theft from the cookhouse," he said, "systematic, over a period of weeks." He held up a ledger she didn't recognize. "I have documentation." She didn't move. She was watching the ledger in his hand. It was not the composition book from behind the bean sack. She had checked it that morning, still there. But it was the right size, the right color, and from 20 feet away in the glare of the morning sun, it could have been. "That's not my ledger," she said. Her voice carried clearly. She had cooked for 38 men for 6 weeks. She knew how to project. Granger looked at her with the measured calm of a man who has anticipated exactly this response. "The records here show consistent discrepancies between what was ordered for this ranch and what's been accounted for in the kitchen." "I'd like to see those records," she said. "You'll have an opportunity." His voice was smooth. "As will the county sheriff when he arrives. I sent for him yesterday." A murmur moved through the crew. She held very still. "Until then," Granger said, "I'm going to ask Mrs. Mercer to remain on the property and refrain from— Those records are fraudulent." It came from near the back. Every head turned. Nathan had straightened from the fence post. He was standing fully upright for the first time in what she realized, retrospectively, was probably years. Not hunched into the apologetic posture of a man trying not to be noticed, but at his full height, which was considerable, with his shoulders squared and his face open and direct, in a way she had never seen on him before. Granger's expression changed. Not much. He was too controlled for much, but she caught it. A flicker of something. Uncertainty, maybe, or the recognition of something unexpected. "Ward," he said, with the flat dismissal of a man addressing someone far below him. "This isn't your concern." "It is, actually," Nathan said. He was already moving through the crew, who parted for him with the instinctive response to a man who is moving with purpose. He came to the front of the assembly and stopped, and he looked at Granger across the space between them. "My name is Nathan Holloway," he said. He said it quietly, but the yard was so silent it carried to every corner. "I own this ranch." The silence that followed was absolute in the way that very few silences are. Even the horses in the corral seemed to stop. Granger stared at him. For 3 full seconds, the foreman's carefully maintained surface showed every crack in it. Confusion, disbelief, and underneath both of those, a cold and rapid calculation beginning to run. "That's—" Granger started. "I've been working here as a common laborer for 3 years, Nathan said, still quietly. "I know every man on this property. I know what's been moved, when and where it's gone." He reached inside his shirt and removed the leather folder. "I have 3 years of documentation, dates, amounts, freight contacts. The cattle shortfall alone is enough for a criminal charge. The supply diversion your men have been running out of that locked shed to the northwest—" He paused, and something flickered through the crew, a stir of recognition. Adds considerably to it. Granger had recovered his composure, or most of it. The calculation behind his eyes was running fast. "You have no authority here," he said. "You've been operating under a false identity. Anything you claim to have documented while misrepresenting yourself—" "I didn't misrepresent myself to anyone," Nathan said. "I used a different name. I never claimed to be someone else's employee or signed any documents under false pretenses. I worked this ranch as a laborer. I have the right to do that on my own property. The business agent has operational authority. Harkins has the authority I gave him, which is to maintain standard operations," Nathan said, "not to enable the systematic theft of my livestock and supplies." He looked at Granger steadily. "And not to arrest a woman on your instruction." Granger's eyes moved to Evelyn. She was standing straight, watching him, and she had her hand in her apron pocket, not on a weapon because she wasn't carrying one, but on the letter to Harkins, which was still there. "The ledger you're holding," she said, directing herself to the assembled crew as much as to Granger, "is not my record book. My records have been kept separately since the day I arrived, and they account for every item in that cookhouse. I'd invite any man here to look at them." She held Granger's gaze. "All of you have been eating short for months. Not because I was stealing your food, because he was selling it." The murmur that moved through the crowd now was different from before. Not uncertainty this time, something harder. Briggs, the man who had pushed his bowl back at her in the serving line, spoke from somewhere in the middle of the group. "The shed," he said, "northwest of the barn. What's in it?" Granger's composure showed another crack. "That's ranch equipment. Then let's open it," Harlan said. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, straight-backed, with the quiet authority of a man who has spent 60 years earning the right to say a thing and mean it. Several men near him straightened slightly, reflexively, in the way that happens when someone who is genuinely respected speaks. Granger looked at Harlan, then at Nathan, then at Evelyn. It was the look of a man rapidly assessing an exit and finding that the exits had been quietly closed. "This is," he started. "Open the shed," Denny said. He was flushed and visibly nervous, but his voice was steady. "If there's nothing wrong in there, then open it and we'll see." Granger turned on Denny with an expression that would have silenced the boy a month ago, and Denny swallowed hard and held his ground anyway, which Evelyn thought was one of the braver things she had seen on this ranch. What happened next was not clean or dramatic in the way of stories that have been tidied up in the telling. Granger made a decision. She could see him make it, could see the moment the calculation resolved, and the decision was not to open the shed. Instead, he turned and walked to the main house. The yard stood suspended for a moment. Then Nathan said to Pell and Cutter specifically, "Don't follow him." His voice was different now. Not loud, but carrying an authority that was simply there, the way the authority of ownership is simply there when someone stops hiding it. Pell and Cutter exchanged a look, and neither of them moved. Nathan looked at Harlan. "I need 4 men to come with me to the main house. Volunteers only." Harlan stepped forward immediately. 3 others followed, including, after a brief hesitation, Briggs. Evelyn said, "I'm coming." Nathan looked at her with an expression that was not quite protest and not quite agreement. "You don't have to—" "The letter's in my pocket," she said. He understood immediately. The letter to Harkins, still unsent, still on her person. If Granger got to it before Denny reached Garrison Flats on Saturday, there was no record of their contact with Cheyenne. "Stay behind me," he said. "I'll stay where I need to be," she said. He looked at her for one more second and then turned toward the main house. They went in through the front door, which was unlocked. Granger had gone in too fast to secure it behind him, which was its own sign of a man who had started to panic. The main house was dark, shuttered, with the musty stillness of rooms that had been closed for years. Furniture under canvas sheets, the smell of old wood and dust and something else, something that didn't belong. Recent habitation. Someone had been using this space. Granger was in the study. He had the desk drawers open when they came in, and he was pulling papers out with the particular urgency of a man who knows exactly which papers matter and is trying to make them disappear. He turned when they entered, and his face had shed all of its smoothness now, leaving something underneath that was less assured and more dangerous. On the desk, visible before he could cover them, were papers with the ranch's letterhead. Property transfer documents. Partially completed. The buyer's name visible at the top, a land and cattle company in Denver that Evelyn had never heard of. Nathan saw them at the same time she did. "Step away from the desk," he said. Granger had a gun on his hip, which was normal for a working ranch foreman, and Evelyn watched his hand and watched Nathan watch his hand. Nathan was not armed or not visibly. She noted this with the swift, cold clarity that comes to a person when a situation has moved into territory where being unarmed matters. "You can't prove who you are," Granger said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but a thinner control. "You have no documents on you. You've been living as a laborer for 3 years. You think anyone's going to take your word over mine?" "I think the property transfer documents on that desk," Nathan said, "are going to explain themselves." Granger's eyes went to the desk, then to the papers Nathan was still holding, then to Evelyn. He looked at her with something she couldn't categorize for a moment. Not contempt exactly, but the closest thing to it, the look of a man who had underestimated something and was deciding whether to admit it. "The woman's a thief," he said, almost reflexively, as though the accusation was still useful. "The woman has 40 days of records that say otherwise," Nathan said. "And I've watched her work this kitchen since she arrived. She hasn't taken so much as a coffee bean." Harlan, from behind them, "I'll vouch for that. I've worked this ranch 19 years. She's the most honest cook we've had." Briggs, after a pause, said, "Yeah." And then, with the stiff dignity of a man acknowledging he'd been wrong, "Yeah, I'll say the same." Granger looked at the room, at Nathan, at Evelyn, at the 4 ranch hands behind them and the sound of the rest of the crew still assembled outside, at the papers on the desk that he hadn't had time to remove. For a moment, the room held everything suspended. The evidence, the witnesses, the history of 3 years of patient watching, and one woman's 43 days of careful, unflinching accounting. Then Granger did what cornered men so often do, which was something desperate and fast and poorly considered. He grabbed the property transfer papers from the desk and made for the window. It was Harlan who moved first, faster than anyone expected from a 60-year-old man, stepping sideways and catching Granger's arm as he passed. The papers scattered. Briggs got to the window before Granger did, and Nathan caught Granger by the shoulder and simply stopped him with the contained physical authority of a man who has been doing hard ranch labor for 3 years and is considerably stronger than a man in a foreman's position tends to be. Granger struggled. Not for long. The numbers were against him, and he knew it. It was over in less than a minute, though it didn't feel like less than a minute. It felt much longer, the way things feel longer when the outcome hasn't resolved yet. When it resolved, Granger was restrained between Briggs and a hand named Cord, who had appeared from the doorway, and the papers were on the floor, and Nathan was breathing harder than he'd like, and Evelyn was in the corner of the room with her back to the wall and her hand still in her apron pocket on the letter. Not because she'd been afraid, because the letter was the evidence, and protecting evidence was the job. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Denny appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed, slightly out of breath from running. He looked at Granger between the 2 men. He looked at the scattered papers. He looked at Evelyn. "Is it?" he started. "Yes," she said. "It's done." She took the letter out of her pocket and held it out to him. "Go to Garrison Flats," she said. "Tonight, not Saturday. And if you can get to the telegraph office before it closes, send a wire to Harkins in Cheyenne first." Denny took the letter. His face was flushed and his hat was crooked, and he looked at her with the expression of a young man who has just witnessed something that will be significant in the story he tells about his life. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He ran. Evelyn lowered herself onto a chair that was against the wall because her knees were slightly unreliable at the moment, though she would not have admitted this to anyone. She pressed her hand flat on her thigh and breathed slowly. Across the room, Nathan was picking up the scattered papers. He moved through them methodically, organizing them, and his hands were steady, which she found herself grateful for in a way she couldn't quite account for. She hadn't realized she'd been watching his hands as a gauge of how serious things were. He looked up and found her watching him. His face was open and tired and something else she didn't have a word for yet, and the afternoon light coming through the gaps in the shuttered windows laid itself across the dust-covered room in long strips. "Are you all right?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. Her back hurt. Her hands were shaking slightly now that she noticed. She had spent 43 days working at full stretch in a kitchen on a ranch where someone had been trying to ruin her, and the last 2 hours had been the kind of 2 hours she didn't particularly want to repeat. "I'll be better," she said, "when I've got my hands back in the kitchen." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "There's still the sheriff to deal with," he said, "and Harkins. And I know," she said, "one thing at a time." Outside, through the shuttered windows, she could hear the crew in the yard, the low, steady sound of men whose understanding of the situation was shifting, rearranging, settling into a new shape. The sound of a ranch reconsidering itself. The evidence was in hand. Granger was contained. The letter was on its way. But she had been around enough trouble to know that the moment a thing appeared to be over was often the moment it had one more move left to make. She stayed in the chair and kept her breathing even, and watched Nathan organize the papers with careful, methodical hands, and she thought about the cookhouse, and the stove that needed tending, and the crew that still needed to eat dinner, and all the ordinary, necessary grounding work that was still there, as it always was, waiting for the immediate crisis to exhaust itself so that life could go on. She thought about the padlock on the shed to the northwest, and what was in it, and what it would tell the sheriff when he arrived. And she thought about how far they had come, and how far they still had to go, and how much of the distance between here and something that might be called resolution still depended on things she couldn't control. She pressed her hand flat on her thigh and breathed. One thing at a time. They locked Granger in the tack room. It wasn't a jail cell, but it had a solid door, a heavy bolt on the outside, and no windows large enough for a man to pass through. Nathan made the decision without ceremony, and Briggs and Cord walked Granger across the yard with the grim efficiency of men who had decided where their loyalty now sat and were not inclined to be subtle about it. Granger went without struggling. He had stopped struggling the moment the numbers made it pointless, but he walked with the contained fury of a man cataloging everything and everyone, storing it all away for later use. Evelyn watched from the doorway of the main house until they had him inside and the bolt was thrown. She felt the tension in her shoulders drop approximately half an inch. Not all the way, but some. The crew had dispersed from the yard with the slightly dazed quality of men who have witnessed something significant and need time to integrate it. Harlan was moving among them. She could see him through the window, talking quietly to the older hands, the ones who had been here long enough to have known Redstone Ranch before Granger, and whose understanding of the afternoon's events was therefore more layered and personal than the younger men's. Denny was already gone, riding hard toward Garrison Flats with the letter and strict instructions about the telegraph. Nathan came back from the tack room and found her still in the doorway. "He'll be all right in there for the night," he said. "Cord's going to sit outside." "Is Cord trustworthy?" "About as trustworthy as anyone on this ranch right now, which is to say I think so, but I'm not certain." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she hadn't seen from him before. The gesture of a man who has been careful and controlled for a long time, and is starting, incrementally, to put the control down. "I need to get into the shed before dark. The documentation in there will be more compelling than anything on paper." "I'm coming with you," she said. He started to say something. "Nathan," she said, "I am coming with you." He looked at her for a moment, then he turned and picked up a bolt cutter from the barn. The shed sat in the long shadows of late afternoon, the red rocks beyond it catching the last highlight and throwing it back orange and rust. The padlock was as heavy as she remembered. Nathan cut it without much difficulty. The bolt cutters were industrial grade, the kind kept for ranch fencing, and swung the door open. The smell hit them first, salt and wood, and something underneath that was unmistakably meat, dried and stored. Then their eyes adjusted and the interior resolved out of the dimness into something that made Evelyn draw a slow breath through her nose. Shelves along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, stacked with goods. Sacks of flour. The expensive, finely milled kind, not the standard issue. Tinned goods in quantities that no ranch crew would consume in a season. Coils of good rope still wrapped. Boxes of ammunition. And at the back, hanging from iron hooks, sides of dried beef that she recognized by their weight and cut as premium grade. The kind the ranch's suppliers charged significant prices for. None of it was in quantities consistent with personal use. All of it had been systematically removed from the ranch's operating inventory and stored here, awaiting redistribution. Nathan walked the shelves slowly. She watched him take it in. He was quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet from his Caleb Ward quiet, that had been the quiet of a man making himself small. This was the quiet of a man absorbing the full cost of something he had allowed to happen on his property while he was hiding from his own life. 3 years, he said, to no one in particular. "Stop," she said. He looked at her. "There'll be time to think about that later," she said. Not unkindly, but firmly, because he was starting to go somewhere in his head that wasn't useful right now, and she could see it happening. "Right now, we document what's here, and we make sure the door is secured until the sheriff arrives, and we get through tonight." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. They spent an hour in the shed, Nathan writing in the margin of the documentation he'd brought, Evelyn counting and categorizing aloud while he recorded. It was methodical and unglamorous, and she found it settling. The return to the kind of work that had a clear procedure, where you put one number after another and the truth accumulated without argument. By the time they were done, the sun was at the horizon and the red rocks had gone dark. They walked back to the main cluster of buildings in the cooling air, the shed secured behind them with a length of rope and a hand named Arlo sitting 10 yards away on an upturned crate with the focused expression of a 19-year-old trying very hard to look like he wasn't nervous. "Arlo?" Nathan said as they passed. "Mr. Holloway," Arlo said. He said the name with the particular care of someone still adjusting to a fact that had recently rearranged itself. "Anyone comes near that door besides me or Mrs. Mercer, you call out, loud." "Yes, sir." They kept walking. Evelyn said quietly, "He's going to be terrified all night." "Yes," Nathan said, "but he'll do it." She believed that. Arlo was one of those people, not brave exactly, but unable to be something other than what he was, which amounted to the same thing in practice. In the cookhouse, she built the fire back up and started on the evening meal. The crew still needed to eat. Whatever else was happening, that had not changed, and the ordinary requirement of feeding 38 men had a grounding effect on her that she was genuinely grateful for. She made a simple supper, beans and salt pork and the last of the morning's cornbread warmed through. And it was on the table by 7, and the crew came through the line with an unfamiliar quietness, each man taking his portion and sitting down and eating without the usual undercurrent of noise and movement. They looked at her differently. Not all of them. Some of the men still wouldn't meet her eyes, though whether that was guilt or something else she couldn't say. But several of them, including Briggs, who came through the line with his jaw set in the expression of a man doing something harder than it looks, said, "Thank you." He said it quietly and without elaboration and then moved along. She nodded and served the next man. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had 3 hours ago, and she understood how these things worked. The trust rebuilt itself not in declarations but in these small, concrete exchanges, one at a time. Nathan ate at the end of the table. She noticed that no one crowded him out anymore, that the men around him made room with the new awareness of who he was, and that he sat with a posture slightly different from the one she'd seen for 6 weeks. Still quiet, still not taking up more space than necessary, but no longer actively trying to disappear. When the crew was gone, she put a proper plate together for him. Enough food this time, not the end-of-line remainder she'd been supplementing for weeks, and set it in front of him. He looked at it and then at her with an expression she didn't examine too closely. "Eat," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in 3 years." He almost smiled. The portions were short. "That was not my fault." "No," he said, "it wasn't." She sat down across from him with her own food, and they ate in the comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to perform at each other for a while. After a few minutes, he said, "The sheriff should be in Garrison Flats by tomorrow morning if Denny's wire reached Mill Haven tonight. He'll likely be here by afternoon." "And Harkins?" "Cheyenne's further. 2 days? Maybe 3, if he comes in person." He looked at the table. "He'll need to verify who I am. It can't be done by wire." "Do you have anything here that documents your identity? The deed? Personal papers?" "The deed's in Cheyenne with Harkins, but I have letters in my kit that are addressed to Nathan Holloway. The original employment agreement from when I hired the previous foreman Coates. It has my signature." He paused. "It's enough, I think. With the property transfer documents from the desk and the shed inventory and your records and—" He looked at her directly. "Your account of what happened here. A witness account from someone with no financial stake in the property." She considered this. A woman's word. "A cook's word," he said, "which in a legal proceeding is—" "I know what it is in a legal proceeding," she said. "I've been a woman in Wyoming for 6 weeks, Nathan. I have a fair sense of how the law weighs what I say." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll make sure your records are entered into evidence, the composition book, everything." "Good." She pushed food around her plate. "What happens to the crew? If there's a legal process and investigation, the ranch operation doesn't stop for that." He shook his head. "It can't. There are cattle out there that need tending regardless of what's happening in the main house." He looked at the far wall, thinking. "Harlan can run the daily operations. He's done it before, informally. The men respect him." "He'll do it," she said. "He just needs to be asked properly." Nathan looked at her. You know these men better than I do, he said. It came out as an observation without self-pity. I've been feeding them 3 times a day for 6 weeks, she said. You learn people when you feed them. It's one of the things cooking is actually for. He was quiet for a moment, sitting with that. Will you stay? He asked. Through the investigation, the legal business, I know this isn't... I have nowhere else to be, she said. Which was true, but it wasn't the whole of it, and she thought they both knew that. She gathered the plates and went back to the kitchen. The night passed with the specific tension of nights, when something unresolved is locked in the tack room, and a boy is sitting outside a shed, and you're waiting on a wire from Garrison Flats. She slept in intervals, waking at small sounds that turned out to be the wind or the horses, lying with her ears tuned to the property's sounds, the way she had tuned them to the sounds of a sick room once, years ago. At 2:30 in the morning, she heard something that wasn't the wind. She was upright before she was fully awake, feet on the cold floor, listening. A sound from the direction of the tack room. Not a shout. Cord would have shouted. Something quieter. Then footsteps, fast and purposeful, crossing the yard away from the bunkhouse. She pulled her dress on over her nightgown, shoved her feet into her boots without lacing them, and moved to the cookhouse door. The yard was silver with moonlight. She could see the tack room door. The bolt was still thrown, and Cord was slumped against the wall beside it in a way that wasn't sleep. Her stomach dropped. She crossed to him fast. He was breathing. She could see the rise and fall. But he was unconscious, and when she put her hand to the back of his head, her fingers came away with blood on them. Hit from behind, hard enough to put him down, but not hard enough to... She heard the main house door open. She pressed herself against the wall of the tack room in the shadow and looked across the yard. A figure moving from the main house with something under each arm. She couldn't see what in the dark, but the shapes were wrong for a person's normal carriage. Too bulky, too deliberate. Moving toward the barn. The tack room bolt. Still thrown. She looked at the door, then at the figure disappearing into the barn. Not Granger. Granger was inside, which meant Pell or Cutter or someone else who had decided that the day's events required a response under cover of dark. She looked at the barn, then at the main house, which the figure had exited and left the door standing open. The property transfer documents, Nathan's identification letters. The cash payroll that she knew from the monthly accounts was kept in the main house safe, a detail she'd absorbed from the crew's conversations without ever intending to. She moved toward the main house. The front door swung on its hinges in the slight wind. Inside, the darkness was almost complete, the moonlight cutting in through the open door only enough to see outlines. She knew this room. She'd been in it that afternoon. She had the layout in her memory. Desk on the left. Safe behind the painting on the right wall. She'd seen the painting swung out when Nathan was dealing with Granger's papers. The safe was open. She could see it from across the room, the metal door catching the moonlight. And on the desk, the papers. Some still there, some gone. Disorder suggesting a quick search conducted with a flashlight or a struck match. She was 2 steps into the room when she heard him behind her. She turned. Pell. He was carrying a lantern now, shuttered to a thin slit of light, and under his other arm were documents and something that clinked. The cash box, she realized, from the weight and sound of it. He stopped when he saw her, and the particular quality of his stillness was different from Nathan's, different from any stillness she'd encountered in 6 weeks on this ranch. It was the stillness of a man deciding. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, very quiet. "Pell," she said, equally quiet. They looked at each other across the room. He was between her and the door. He had the cash box and the documents. He was a man who had just knocked another man unconscious, which told her something specific and important about where his calculation currently sat. She did not move. Moving suddenly was not the right answer here, and she knew it the way she knew the stove was ready without checking the temperature. Instinct built from long attention to circumstances. "You don't want to take those," she said. "The sheriff's coming tomorrow," he said. He wasn't asking. "Then running now gives you 1 night's head start and the rest of your life looking over your shoulder," she said, which is not the same thing as being free. Something moved in his face. She pressed it. "Leave the box," she said. "Leave the papers. Walk back to the bunkhouse. In the morning, when the sheriff comes, you tell him what you know about Granger's operation." She held his eyes. "You're not the one who built this." That matters in a court. Pell looked at the box under his arm, then at her. He was calculating, the same way men like him always calculated. But she had disrupted the calculation by being here, and disrupted calculations sometimes fall in unexpected directions. He'll say I was part of it, Pell said. Granger. He'll drag me down with him. Probably, she said. But the man who comes forward has a better chance than the man who ran. She didn't soften it. Softening it would have been an insult to his intelligence. A lawyer will tell you the same thing. The lantern's thin light moved slightly as his arm shifted. He was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has run out of good options and is trying to determine which bad option is least bad. Then he set the cash box on the floor. He set the papers beside it. He looked at her for one more second. If Granger names me, he started. Tell the truth, she said. That's the only move you have left. He looked at the box on the floor. Then he turned and walked past her out the front door. She waited until she heard his footsteps cross the yard and the bunkhouse door close. Then she sat down on the edge of the desk because her legs were not as steady as she'd been presenting them, and she breathed slowly for a moment, looking at the cash box on the floor. She needed to wake Nathan. She needed to check on Cord. She needed to secure the documents and re-bolt the main house and go back to her cookhouse and make sure the fire was banked properly for the morning. There was a significant amount of practical work still to do. She sat for another 30 seconds. Then she picked up the cash box, tucked the papers under her arm, and went to find Nathan. He was in the bunkhouse, asleep in the bunk that had been Caleb Ward's bunk for 3 years. She'd had Harlan show her which one when they'd been making the evening security arrangements. She knocked on the bunkhouse door and Harlan, who had apparently been not sleeping either, opened it. There's been a development, she said. Harlan looked at the cash box. Lord, he said, Cord's outside the tack room with a head injury. He's breathing. We need someone to sit with him. Harlan was already moving. She woke Nathan. He came awake fast, the way people do who have been sleeping light, and sat up and looked at the cash box under her arm and the papers and her face and ran through the sequence quickly. Pell, she said, where is he now? Bunkhouse. He put it down and walked away. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, sitting on the edge of the bunk with his boots unlaced and his hair at the wrong angle, and his face did something complicated that she didn't try to interpret fully. You talked him down, he said. I didn't have a lot of other options available. Evelyn, Nathan, she said, firmly but not unkindly. Cord needs attention. We need to secure the main house, and I need to be back in the cookhouse by 4 because there are 38 men who are going to want breakfast regardless of what happened tonight. He looked at her for one more second. Then he stood up and reached for his boots. You're right, he said. Let's go. They crossed the yard together in the moonlight, the cash box under her arm, the papers under his, and the red rocks in the distance stood dark against the sky, and the whole vast quiet of Wyoming lay around them in every direction, indifferent as ever, patient as stone. Cord had come around by the time they reached him, sitting up against the wall with Harlan beside him, pressing a wet cloth to the back of his head, and swearing in the quiet, continuous way of old men who are worried about something. I'll live, Cord said, when he saw their faces. Probably, Evelyn said. She crouched beside him and looked at the wound. Ugly, but not deep. The kind that bled dramatically and healed fine. Does your vision feel right? He blinked experimentally. More or less. More or less is good enough for tonight, she said. Tomorrow you let me look at it properly. She stood up and looked at the tack room door. The bolt still thrown. Granger was still inside. Whatever Pell had planned, or whoever had given Pell his instructions, the plan hadn't included actually freeing Granger, which meant it was about the money and the documents, not about facilitating an escape, which meant Granger didn't know. Whatever Pell had been doing, he'd been doing it for himself. She filed this away. It would matter to the sheriff tomorrow. The rest of the night passed without further incident, though none of them slept much. Nathan took the first watch on the tack room door himself, sitting outside it in a chair with his arms folded and his eyes open with the look of a man who has decided to stop letting other people carry things for him. Evelyn went back to the cookhouse at 3:30 and got the fire going and started the coffee, and by 4:15 she had biscuits in the oven and the first pale light was starting at the eastern edge of the sky over the red rocks. Harlan came in at 4:30, poured himself coffee without asking, and sat down at the long table. "Sheriff will be here by 2, he said. "I know," she said. "The crew's going to be unsettled." "Yes, but they'll work." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "These are men who work. That's what they know how to do. Give them a task, and they'll do it." "Will you run operations today?" Nathan said. "I know what to do," Harlan said simply. He wasn't prideful about it, just factual. "I've been doing it quietly for a while now anyway." Granger liked having someone to make his decisions look competent. She almost smiled at that. "I know the type." "Expect you do," Harlan said. He looked at his coffee, then at her, with those sharp old eyes. "You're going to be all right here, Mrs. Mercer." She set a biscuit in front of him without commentary. He ate it with the appreciation of a man who doesn't waste appreciation on small things, which meant when he expressed it, it was real. The crew came through for breakfast with the quietness of the night before, amplified. They'd all heard the movement in the yard by now, the whispered accounts moving bunk to bunk the way accounts do on a ranch where privacy is limited. They looked at Evelyn and they looked at the cash box, which Nathan had placed on the shelf behind the serving line as a kind of visible accounting. It was there, intact, not missing, and they ate their biscuits and drank their coffee and went out to do the work that Harlan directed them to. Nathan ate with the crew for the first time not at the end of the line. He sat in the middle, which was its own small statement, and he ate the same food everyone else ate, and the men around him adjusted to it with the gradual naturalness of water finding its level. Denny rode back into the yard at 10:30, covered in trail dust and grinning despite himself. "Sheriff sends word he'll be here by 2, he said. "And Harkins is coming from Cheyenne, day after tomorrow." He said it to Nathan, but he was looking at Evelyn when he said it, and she nodded once at him, which seemed to satisfy some need he'd had for acknowledgement. "Good work," Nathan said. Denny stood up a little straighter. "Also," he said, slightly less certainly, "Granger's got a contact in Garrison Flats, at the freight office, a man named Dobler." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. Telegraph operator mentioned Dobler sent a wire to Denver 2 days ago. He didn't know the content, but he thought. Nathan took the paper, looked at it. His jaw tightened. "The Denver buyer," Evelyn said. She was already thinking ahead, because this was what she did. Fed one thing into the next thing, kept the sequence moving. They may have already been notified about the property transfer. If they sent a representative, if a buyer's agent shows up before Harkins does, Nathan said, we have a problem. Then we make sure the property transfer documents are clearly in evidence before that happens, she said, visibly, formally, with witnesses. She looked at Nathan. "Can you write an affidavit? Today? Before the sheriff arrives? Attesting to your identity and ownership, signed and witnessed by Harlan and 2 other men." He looked at her. "Harlan was here before Granger," she said. "He knows the property. His witness testimony carries weight, and an affidavit written before the sheriff's arrival shows initiative, not reaction." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've thought about this a lot." "I've been thinking about it since 2:30 this morning," she said. Someone had to. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The look of a man who is beginning to let himself respond to things he'd kept locked down for a long time. "I'll write it now," he said. She gave him the work table and paper from the cookhouse supplies, and while he wrote, she made the midday meal, and the ranch turned on its axis around the cookhouse the same way it always did. Because whatever else happened, people needed to eat, and she was the one who knew how. At 2:05, the sheriff's horse came over the rise. Evelyn stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched him come down into the yard. A heavy-set man in a county badge with a deputy behind him, and the particular look of a man who has ridden 40 miles and been told something complicated and is not yet sure he believes it. Nathan met him in the yard. He was standing straight, the affidavit in one hand and the property transfer documents in the other, with Harlan beside him and Briggs and Cord with a bandage at the back of his head that Evelyn had applied at noon, standing slightly behind. She watched from the doorway as Nathan began to talk. She didn't go out. There would be time for that. Her testimony, her records, her composition book with 43 days of numbers that told a truth no one could argue with. The sheriff would want to speak with her, and she would speak with him clearly and in detail and without apology. But right now, in this moment, She let Nathan carry it. Not because she needed him to carry it for her, but because it was his ranch and his name and 3 years of his life that Granger had been dismantling, and he had spent long enough in the background. She watched the sheriff look at the documents. Watch him look at Nathan. Watch something in the sheriff's skeptical face begin, incrementally, to shift. Behind the tack room door, Granger was quiet. He had been quiet all day, which was its own kind of information. Not the quiet of a man resigned, but the quiet of a man conserving. She had no doubt he was still thinking, still calculating, still looking for the angle that would serve him. Men like Granger didn't stop calculating just because the numbers had run against them. But the evidence was assembled. The witnesses were here. The documents were in the sheriff's hands. And she had her composition book, behind the bean sack, 43 days of careful numbers that said simply and undeniably she had done her job, and done it honestly, in a place that had tried very hard to tell a different story about her. She turned back to her kitchen. She had a fire to tend and a crew to feed and work to do, the same as every other day since she'd arrived, and she was not finished yet. The sheriff's name was Aldous Pruitt, and he was not a man who arrived at conclusions quickly, which Evelyn decided was probably a virtue in a lawman, even when it was deeply inconvenient in the moment. He spent the rest of that afternoon moving through the property with the methodical patience of someone who had been wrong before and didn't intend to be wrong again. He inspected the shed. He went through the property transfer documents with the careful attention of a man who reads slowly but reads everything. He spoke with Nathan for a long time in the main house study, and then he spoke with Harlan, and then Briggs, and then Cord, who sat through his interview with the bandaged head and the slightly unfocused look of a man running on 2 hours of sleep and a headache. He came to Evelyn last. She had expected this. She had the composition book on the table in front of her and a cup of coffee on the side, because she had learned that people conducted difficult conversations better when something warm was in their hands, and she intended for this to go well. Pruitt sat down across from her, put his hat on the table, and looked at the composition book. "That your record?" he asked. 43 days, she said. "Every item in and out of this larder, dated and noted. I can walk you through any entry." He picked it up. He read it with the same slow thoroughness he'd applied to the transfer documents, and she let him read without interrupting, which was harder than it sounded because there were things she wanted to say, and she had learned that sometimes the most effective thing you can do in a room is wait. When he set it down, he looked at her with eyes that had seen a considerable amount over what she estimated were 60-some years of Wyoming living. "You've been keeping this since day one," he said. "Day one," she said. "I've kept kitchen records my whole working life. I know what's in my larder and what isn't." "Why start immediately, before any accusation was made?" She looked at him. "Because I arrived at a new job with nothing but my reputation and my skills," she said. "And I've learned that women in my position are not extended the benefit of the doubt as a default. I keep records because I can't afford not to." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the book, then at her. "The gap in the initial inventory," he said. "The goods that were already missing when you arrived. Cross-reference with the dates in Mr. Holloway's documentation," she said. "The pattern is consistent. The removal schedule aligns with the freight connection in Garrison Flats." "You figured out the freight connection yourself?" "The 10-day interval," she said, "and a wagon going northwest instead of southeast toward the main road." Pruitt looked at her with an expression she recognized, the look of a man recalibrating something. She had seen it on the crew's faces after the yard assembly, the specific recalibration of someone who had walked in with one picture of a person and was leaving with a different one. "Granger's going to claim you're part of it," Pruitt said, "that you and Holloway arranged this together, that the records are fabricated." "He's welcome to claim that," she said. "The records are 43 days of daily entries in ink that dried at different rates and was written under different conditions. You can see where I was rushed and where I had time. You can see the corrections I made when I miscounted. Fabricated records don't look like that." She held his eyes. "And Mr. Holloway and I had approximately 6 weeks of almost no private conversation before the night I learned who he was. The crew can testify to that. Denny, Harlan, any of them." Pruitt picked up his hat. He held it for a moment. "The man in the tack room," he said, "is going to have a lawyer in from Cheyenne inside a week. Man like Granger doesn't operate the way he operated without connections. This isn't going to be clean or fast." "I know," she said. "You're prepared for that? To remain on the property, give testimony when needed, potentially travel to county proceedings. I'm prepared, she said. He stood up. He looked at the composition book one more time, then at her. That's good record keeping, he said, which from Aldous Pruitt appeared to be the highest available form of praise. He took Granger to Millhaven that evening, cuffed and loaded in the back of the deputy's wagon. Granger came across the yard without looking at anyone, which was somehow worse than if he'd been defiant. The tight inward quality of a man saving everything for later, for the room where lawyers would be present. At the cookhouse doorway, without planning to, Evelyn stepped outside and stood in the yard as he passed. He looked at her. She had expected hatred or contempt. What she got was something more complicated and less satisfying, a long, appraising look, the look of a man acknowledging an opponent which she hadn't asked to be and didn't particularly want to be. Then he looked forward again and kept walking. The wagon rolled out of the yard and down the road and around the rise and was gone. The yard was very quiet for a moment. Then Harlan said, from somewhere behind her, "Supper ought to be on soon, I expect." "It ought to be," she agreed. She went back inside. Harkins arrived from Cheyenne 2 days later, a compact, precise man of perhaps 50 who wore his suit on a working ranch, with the determined commitment of someone who has decided that standards must be maintained regardless of geography. He was flustered in the way of a man who has been managing a complicated situation from a distance and has just discovered the situation was considerably more complicated than reported. He spoke with Nathan for 3 hours in the main house study, with the door closed, and Evelyn could hear the register of their voices through the cookhouse wall. Not the words, but the shape of the conversation, which moved from tense to quiet to something that sounded, by the end, like agreement. Nathan came to find her afterward. She was making bread, her hands in the dough, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with the look of a man who has just had a long, difficult conversation and has come through it more or less intact. "It's confirmed," he said. "Harkins has the documentation. He's satisfied about who I am." A pause. "He's also mortified about Granger, for whatever that's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "He's a legal witness to your identity now. That matters for the property questions." "Yes." He leaned against the doorframe. "The Denver buyer's agent arrived in Garrison Flats yesterday, apparently. Harkins sent word. He'll handle it." "Good." She turned the dough. "And Pell?" "Turned himself in this morning. Pruitt's deputy came for him. He was quiet for a moment. He asked me to tell you, Pell did, that you were right, about the lawyer." She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. She hoped Pell had enough truth left to tell that it would count for something. She thought he probably did. "Cutter left," Nathan said. "I know. Harlan told me, 2 nights ago." "He took a horse." "I know that too." Nathan looked at her. "You're very well informed." "I feed the men who know things," she said. "Information moves with food, always has." He was quiet, watching her work the dough with the look she'd gotten used to. The attentive, present look of a man who is genuinely watching rather than waiting for his turn to speak. It had disconcerted her at first, that quality of his attention. She was used to being looked past. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The main house," he said. "I'm going to open it. Properly. Get the shutters down, get it cleaned, make it a working residence again." He paused. "I've been a ghost here long enough." She looked at him. There was something fragile underneath the straightforwardness of what he just said. Not fragile like breakable, but fragile like new, like a thing that had just decided to grow and wasn't sure yet of the ground. "That's a good decision," she said. "I'll need help," he said. "Not just with the house. With the ranch, the operation, the way things are run." He was choosing his words with care, which she noticed. "Granger ran this place through fear, and I don't know how to run it any other way because I've never run it at all. I've watched it. I've worked it with my hands. But the actual management, Harlan knows the cattle operation," she said. "I know Harlan does. I'm not talking about Harlan." His eyes were steady on her. "I'm talking about the part of this ranch that makes it a place people can live in, not just work at. The part that you've been running for 6 weeks without anyone officially asking you to." She looked at him for a long moment. The bread dough was ready to rest, and she covered it with a cloth and stepped back from the table and wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm a cook," she said. Not dismissively, just stating a fact, the way she stated most things. "You're the person who kept records that saved this ranch," he said. "You're the person who talked Pell down in the dark with no weapon and no backup. You're the person who figured out the freight schedule from a wagon going the wrong direction." He stopped. "The cook title doesn't cover all of that." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the late afternoon light was moving through the cookhouse window, the way it did at this time of year, long and gold and slightly mournful, the light of a season changing. She thought about 43 cents and a letter and a skillet, about arriving in a strange yard in the dark and deciding to stay anyway. About 38 men she'd been feeding for nearly 7 weeks, whose preferences she knew now, whose appetites she could predict, whose moods she could read from how they held their coffee cups. She thought about the composition book behind the bean sack, which had been the most important document on this property for 6 weeks, and which she had written by herself, in the dark, because no one else was paying attention. She thought about Nathan Holloway, who had spent 3 years being nobody, and who was now standing in her kitchen doorway asking her to help him figure out how to be somebody again. "I'd need more than a cook's wage," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, relief maybe, or the thing adjacent to relief when you've been holding your breath and finally don't have to. "That's fair," he said. "And I'd need it to be a real partnership," she said, "not a courtesy title. Real authority over how this place operates." "Yes," he said. "And I'm not moving into the main house," she said. "Not yet. I need to do this right." Understood. She looked at him. He looked back. They were both people who had come to this arrangement by way of loss. Her husband, his wife, the years in between that had stripped things back to something essential. And they both knew that. And neither of them was in a hurry to pretend otherwise. That was its own kind of honesty. "All right," she said. He nodded. Then, because he was still learning how to do this, he said, "Thank you, Evelyn." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We haven't opened those shutters." The shutters came down the following Saturday. Nathan pulled them from the main house windows himself, working from a ladder with the methodical effort of a man doing something that is harder than it looks. Several hands came to help without being asked. Denny first, then Arlo, then Briggs, and eventually Harlan, who supervised the upper windows from the ground with his arms folded and his face in the arrangement that meant he approved, but wasn't going to say so. Evelyn was at the windows from the inside, releasing the interior latches, and when the first pair swung open and the morning light came pouring into the room that had been dark for 3 years, she had to stand still for a moment and let it settle. The dust in the air caught the light and turned to gold, and the room, which was actually a fine room, well-proportioned with good bones under the canvas-draped furniture and the neglect, exhaled something that had been held for a long time. She sneezed, which broke the moment in a useful way. "Need help in there?" Denny called from outside. "I need someone to carry this furniture out to air," she called back, "and someone else to start on the windows. And Arlo, don't just stand there looking at the ladder." They worked through the morning. It was not a transformation. A house closed for 3 years doesn't become habitable in a day. And she was clear-eyed about the work that was ahead. Cleaning, repair, the stove in the main kitchen needing servicing, the root cellar to assess, a list of supplies that would require a trip to Garrison Flats and possibly Cheyenne. But by midday, the main room was cleared and swept and lit with actual daylight for the first time in years. And Nathan stood in the middle of it with his hands at his sides and looked around at it with an expression she didn't try to describe to herself, because some things deserve to be left undescribed. "It's a good room," she said. "My wife chose the proportions," he said. He said it simply, without flinching from it, which was the first time she'd heard him say anything about his wife that wasn't oblique. She had opinions about ceiling height. "She was right," Evelyn said. "The ceiling height is good." He looked at her. Not with grief exactly, or not only grief, with the complicated expression of a man who is discovering that it's possible to speak about something that hurt him without it destroying the room. "Yes," he said. She was. They stood in the good-proportioned room with the light coming through the newly opened windows, and then Evelyn said she needed to get back to the cookhouse for the midday meal, and she went. The legal proceedings took months, the way legal proceedings do. Granger's lawyer came from Cheyenne and was as capable as Pruitt had predicted, and there were depositions and county hearings and a period in which Evelyn made 4 trips to Millhaven to give testimony, each time with the composition book and each time with the same clear, undefended account of 43 days that the lawyer tried from several angles to undermine and was unable to. The composition book became, in the legal record, Exhibit C. She thought about that sometimes. The record she'd started keeping under the larder shelf behind the bean sack because she'd learned not to trust that her word alone would be enough, entered into a county court record as evidence that cleared her name and contributed significantly to a criminal conviction. Granger was convicted on 3 counts of criminal fraud and property theft. Pell, who had told the truth and told it completely, received a lesser sentence. Cutter was found in Colorado 6 weeks later and extradited back to Wyoming, where he was not treated as leniently as Pell. The Denver buyer's claim was dismissed when Harkins formally invalidated the property transfer documents, which were, as Nathan had identified, incomplete and obtained under false pretenses. And the buyer's agent rode back to Colorado with considerably less than he'd arrived expecting. None of it was clean. None of it was fast. There were weeks when the paperwork was suffocating and the uncertainty was wearing, and the ranch had to keep operating through all of it because cattle didn't pause for court dates and hay didn't bail itself, and 38 men still needed 3 meals a day. Evelyn cooked through all of it and kept her records and attended her hearings and came back and cooked again. What changed, slowly and without announcement, was the way the crew moved around her. It happened in the way that real changes usually happen, not in a single moment, but in accumulation. The first time Briggs asked her opinion about the weekly supply order, not Nathan's. The first time 2 of the younger hands stayed after supper to help her with the heavy work of scrubbing the stove without being asked. The first time Harlan, in a discussion about the ranch's provisions for the winter, deferred to her in front of the full crew with the casual naturalness of a man acknowledging an authority he'd already accepted privately. The first time she walked through the yard and the men she passed said good morning with the tone they used for each other, not the careful, somewhat managed courtesy they'd offered the new cook in those first difficult weeks, but the ordinary, unguarded greeting of people who belonged to the same place. She noticed each of these moments. She didn't make anything of them aloud, but she felt them settle into her in the way that things settle when they are true. By the following spring, the main house was fully restored and Nathan was living in it. The root cellar had been assessed and repaired, the stove in the main kitchen had been serviced, and Evelyn cooked there on Sundays, which was not an arrangement anyone had formally agreed to, but which had evolved naturally, the way things evolve when 2 people are spending increasing amounts of time in the same space and have stopped pretending to themselves that it's purely professional. He was not easy to know. That was the honest truth of it. He was private in the way of people who have been hurt in ways that didn't leave clean edges. And there were days when the weight of the 3 years he'd spent being nobody sat on him in a way that closed him off, and she had learned not to push on those days. She had her own version of that weight, her own years of a life she'd had to dismantle and start again. And she understood that some things don't heal on a schedule. What they had was not a romance in any storybook sense. It was built out of practical things, shared records and adjoining kitchens and long conversations at the work table about the ranch's finances and the crew's needs and the winter provision plan. It was built out of respect, which she had always considered the most reliable foundation for anything. And it was built out of the particular bond that forms between people who have seen each other at their worst and most stripped back and decided to stay anyway. On a Friday evening in late April, with the spring grass coming up green in the meadows and the red rocks catching the last light the way they always did, she was on the main house porch with a cup of coffee when Nathan came and sat in the chair beside her. They didn't say anything for a while. The horses were moving in the far corral. Denny was singing something off-key from the direction of the barn, which was a constant feature of life on Redstone Ranch and had become oddly reassuring. "Harkins asked me last week," Nathan said, "what my long-term plans were for the operation." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was rebuilding." He was looking out at the red rocks. "He asked if I had a partner." She looked at her coffee. "What did you tell him?" she asked again. "I told him yes," he said. "I told him I did." She sat with that for a moment. The evening air was cool and smelled like new grass and the cookhouse chimney, which she had finally had properly swept in March, and which now drew the way it should have drawn all along. The sky was going that particular shade of Wyoming blue that happened for about 20 minutes at this time of day, too deep to be afternoon and not yet dark enough to be evening. a color that had no name but which she had come to think of as the color of Redstone Ranch specifically. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again, simply. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a grand moment. It was two people who had stopped pretending that what they were building was anything other than what it was, and who had decided, without ceremony, to keep building it. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. His hand was calloused and scarred, in the way she'd noticed from the very first week. The hands of a man who had done the actual work of this land for 3 years. She turned her hand over and let his close around it. They sat there, while the sky went from blue to dark, and the first stars appeared over the red rocks, and Denny's singing drifted out of the barn, and the horses settled for the night. There are things that nobody tells you about starting over. Nobody tells you that it doesn't feel like starting over, that it feels most days like just living, which is unglamorous and repetitive and sometimes exhausting and occasionally, when you're not paying attention to it, quietly wonderful. Nobody tells you that the people you'll come to trust most are often the people who are overlooked alongside you. Nobody tells you that the records you keep when no one is watching are the most important records you'll ever keep. Nobody tells you that the fresh start you came looking for might not look anything like what you imagined, and that this is not a disappointment, but simply the truth of how things work, that life gives you what it gives you, and what you do with it is the only part that's yours. Evelyn Mercer had come to Redstone Ranch with 43 cents and a letter and a cast iron skillet. She had stayed because there was work to do, and because she was not the kind of person who left work undone, and because somewhere in the middle of all of it, she had stopped looking for a fresh start and started simply living the one she was in. Years later, when people in the territory spoke of Redstone Ranch, and they did speak of it, because it became the kind of place people spoke of, known for its management and its fairness and the lights that burned warm and constant from the main house windows. They spoke of it as a place that had been remade. They said the man who owned it had come back from somewhere nobody quite knew, and the woman he'd partnered with had rebuilt the operation from the ground up, and together they had made something out of a troubled piece of land that the land itself seemed to have been waiting to become. They didn't know the full story, of course. They never do, from the outside. They didn't know about the composition book behind the bean sack, or the night in the main house with the cash box, or the two people sitting across a lamplit table with the evidence of a betrayal spread between them and the weight of what was going to happen next, settling on both of them like snow. They didn't know about the patience it had taken, or the fear she hadn't shown, or the 3 years of a man making himself invisible on his own land, or all the ordinary mornings of 4 a.m. and coffee on and biscuits in the oven before anyone else was awake. What they saw were the results, which is what the outside always sees. But inside, the results were all of those mornings, all of those meals, every number in the composition book, every conversation at the end of the table in the low light when the crew had gone and it was just the two of them trying to figure out what was true and what to do about it. That was the actual story. The one that doesn't have a clean beginning or a tidy end, just people doing their best with what they have in the circumstances they find themselves in, which is the only story there ever really is. In the cookhouse, still hers, still the center of what made the ranch run. The cast iron skillet hung on its hook beside the stove, seasoned black and heavy and permanent, the way good iron gets when it's been properly used for years. It had made the journey from Cheyenne in a carpet bag and had cooked 10,000 meals on a ranch that had tried to swallow the woman who carried it. It was still there. So was she.